Next we'll move on to the channels view. So the channels view is where we're going to be able to manage all of our channels, and we can make, remove, import, export, clone, enable, disable, and deploy our channels. Now we can't undeploy our channels. That can only be done in the dashboard view. And also we can manage our channel groups here as well. So to get to the channels view, we need to navigate to the channels menu item on the Mirth Connect menu at the top left. It's always going to be right below dashboard. Now depending on the number of channels you have, it may take a minute for it to load. As we can see, we have a list of channels and channel groups appear with their statuses and metadata. So this table works like any other table in Mirth. We can enable and disable columns, as well as collapse and expand items. So let's go through the different columns we can see. So first we'll start out with status. So this is going to tell us whether a channel is enabled or disabled. If it's disabled, then we can't deploy the channel. And for channel groups, if there's a channel disabled and enabled, then the status will appear as mixed, as you can see here under our default group. It's because we have the DICOM listener as disabled and we have our other two channels as enabled. But you can see new group is enabled because all of its channels are enabled. Next we'll go to data type. So data type is going to be the data type of the inbound message that the source connector is expecting to receive and process. So you can see for our first channel where we sent in hello world, we have raw. So it's expecting to get a raw message. However, our second channel is expecting HL7. Next we have the name. So the name is just going to be the name of the channel or the channel group. And you can see under here we can expand and collapse some of our channel groups. Next we have ID. So this is going to be the unique ID of the channel or group. Next we have local ID. So this is the unique numeric ID of the channel that's used to identify the channel's set of tables associated with the messages, attachments, and statistics. So if we were able to look into our table in our database for Mirth that holds all of our configurations, then you'd be able to see that there's a Mirth Connect 1 channel table, and that's going to correspond to our first channel. Also, there would be a 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it's going to have all our messages. Next to local ID, we have the description. And the description is just going to be the description of the channel group. So you can see, if you go to edit this channel, we can add a description. And you can see that it now shows our description. Next to description, we're going to have rev. So this is going to be the number of times the channel has been saved and revised since it was last deployed. As you can see here, it'll be highlighted if the channel or any code templates have been changed since it's been last deployed. Next to rev, we have last deployed. So this is going to be the date and time the channel was last deployed. Like the dashboard view, it will be highlighted if it's been within the last 2 minutes. So let's say we deploy our first channel. Go back to the channels view. And it's going to be highlighted because it was deployed in the last 2 minutes. And next to last deployed, we have last modified. So this is going to be the time and date the channel was last modified. So let's now go through some of the menu items we have under the Channels Tasks menu. Here we can access specific tasks related to channels for managing all of our channels and groups. So first up, we have refresh. So this is going to refresh the channels table. So if a colleague updated or added a channel, then we can click this to see their changes. Next we have Redeploy All. So this is going to first undeploy all of our channels and then deploy all the enabled channels. So maybe you change a code template and you want to apply it back to all the channels. So for example, this is only going to deploy all of our enabled channels here. It won't deploy TCP Listener. So let's go ahead and click Redeploy All. Yes. And you can see now all of our last deployed date and times are updated. Let's go back to channels. So under Redeploy All, we have Deploy Channel. So we can select one or more channels and deploy them. We can also select a channel group and deploy all the channels in that group. Note this option is only available if our channel is enabled. So for example, if I tried to click on TCP Listener, the Deploy Channel option is going to go away. This is because you can't deploy a disabled channel. So let's go ahead and deploy our first channel. So as we can see, it updated. Now we can also select a channel group. We also have Deploy Channel. So that's going to deploy all the channels in this group. So if we click on Default Group, we can deploy all of our channels from that group. So you can see that it deployed Test Channel 2. Also, we can select multiple channels by holding down Control and clicking on one channel and then click another channel, and we can deploy channel. So now that deployed our second channel, our first channel, and our test channel 2. And you can see those were the ones that were highlighted. So under Deploy Channel, we have Edit Global Scripts. So this is going to take us to the Global Scripts view. We'll get more into the global scripts in a later lesson. Under Edit Global Scripts, we have Edit Code Templates. And like the Edit Global Scripts, this will also take us to the Edit Code Templates view, where all our code templates can be created, edited, or removed. We'll also go over these in a later lesson. Next we have New Channel. So this will open the Edit Channel view with a new channel template. This is where we can create our new channel. Let's go ahead. So you can see this has all the properties to create our new channel. Note that if I go back to channels and we don't save our changes, it's not going to have a new channel. So when you create a new channel, you have to save changes in order for it to be created. So we'll skip Import Channel for now, and we'll go to Export Channel. So Export Channel is going to allow us to export any channel and save it to an XML file. We can then view the channel XML or import it back into a Mirth Connect instance. So say we wanted to export our first channel, we need to select our channel and then Export Channel. So then we can save it. Now I can view it in my directory. So if we open this in Notepad++, we can see that we have an XML view of the channel. So it tells us what version, and there's also a structure that Mirth exports channel as, where it can interpret and import and export channels. Minimize that. So now say we wanted to import a channel. So we can click Import Channel, and we can select our first channel again. And note that we already have our first channel, so it's going to say it already exists. So we'll say OK. Do we want to override our channel? And that's going to dump us out at the Edit Channels view. And this is where we can give it another name. We can save our changes. This import channel will allow us to import a channel XML, but note that we can only import channels that are below our current version. For example, if we tried to upload a channel created in Mirth Connect 3.11 and tried to upload it to Mirth Connect version 3.6, then it won't work. However, we can upload an earlier version to a more updated version. So if we took a channel from version 3.6 and uploaded it to 3.11, then it would work. So next we have delete channel. So this is just going to be where we can remove a channel and delete all the messages associated with it. So let's go ahead and delete our first channel 2. So we just need to select our first channel 2 and click delete. It's going to ask if you want to delete it. Yes. So next we have clone channel. So this is going to allow us to copy a channel and view the newly copied channel for us to edit. So like the create feature, it won't save our changes and create the channel until we hit save. So if we want to clone our second channel, select and then clone. We'll enter in a new name, so we'll do v2. Okay. We'll save changes. We'll go back to channels. We can see right under our second channel, we're going to have our second channel v2. Then next we have edit channel. So this is going to let us edit our channel that's currently selected. So say we want to go back and edit our second channel v2. So we can either hit edit channel or you can double click the channel. So let's name it something else. Our copied channel. Save. So we can also enable or disable a channel. Right now, since we are selected on our copied channel, we can disable our channel. Let's go ahead and disable it. And then now that our channel is disabled, we have the enabled channel option. Let's go ahead and enable it again. So next we have the view messages. So if we go to a channel that we've deployed already and select it and view channels, this is going to allow us to see our messages that have been sent through. We'll go back to channels. So next we have channel groups. And we can create a group by navigating to the Groups Task menu items on the left and create a new group. So here we can name the group as well as give it a description. So let's go ahead and create a new group. We'll say our new group. We can give it a description. This is just for testing. Click OK. And our new group is here. Now we need to save our group changes. Now if we ever need to edit a group channel details, then we can click the Edit Group Details. We first have to select our group and then Edit Group Details. That takes us back to edit the group details. Just like channels, we can also import and export groups. We also have the option to delete a group. Now we can assign channels to groups in a few different ways. So we can select our channel. We can drag and drop our channel into our group and save changes. Or we can select the channel and go down to our group tasks and assign a group. And here's where we can look through all the groups and assign our channel to our new group. So now they both appear under our new group. Now there's a few cool things we can do with the channel view. So we can select channels and drag and drop them to a text editor, and the names and the channel IDs will be copied. So for example, if I select both of these channels and open up Notepad++, let's create a new page, and click and drag and drop into Notepad++, you can see that we have the channel name and we have the channel IDs. Now another cool thing is that we can drag the channel XML into the channels view and import channels and groups. So for example, I have our first channel XML, so I can grab this and drag and drop into the channels view, and it's going to import my channel. So here we can save our changes. So that's one way of getting around importing channels. So just to review, we discussed the channels view and the different columns that are enabled. We discussed how to create a channel, how to import channels, how to view our code templates and our global scripts, as well as delete a channel, import and export a channel, clone, and disable and enable. We also looked at creating groups and assigning channels to groups. So next we'll get into the bread and butter of Mirth and really figure out how interfaces are built. So channels are the backbone of Mirth, and we can edit them using the Edit Channel view. There's a few ways we can navigate to this screen. So first we need to go into the channels view and look at our channels. We can click on a channel that we want to edit, and we can go to the left side of the screen and see a menu item called Edit Channel. You can click that in order to go into the Edit Channel view. Or you can also go back to Channels and right click on that channel, and you have the same menu item. You can also double click on the channel, and that'll take you to the same view. So once we selected a channel to edit, we can see 4 tabs appear at the top. Summary tab, Source tab, Destinations, and Scripts. We'll first start out with the default tab when opening the Edit Channel view, the Summary tab. So here we can find some general settings about a channel that's not really tied to any of the source connectors and destination connectors. These are things like the name, initial settings, and descriptions. So let's go through some of the settings laid out on this tab. So first we can see the channel properties group. So these are going to be all the properties specific to the channel, either for naming, identification, or some miscellaneous settings. So first, to start off, we have the name. So this is going to be just the name of the channel. We can give it some descriptive name. The only stipulations is we need the name to only consist of alphanumeric characters, spaces, hyphens, and underscores. Notice I didn't say any special characters, so maybe an @ symbol. I just clicked an @ symbol, and you can see how it won't even let me add that. If I click a 2, it'll let me add the 2, but I can't click an @ exclamation point, hashtag, $. It only can be alphanumeric characters, spaces, hyphens, and underscores. Next, we're going to look at the enabled checkbox. So this checkbox indicates whether the channel is ready to be deployed or not. Sometimes when you're configuring your channel, you may run across an error trying to save the channel. When this happens, the channel will be disabled and you won't be able to deploy until you click enabled again. So make sure if you ever see that, just make sure your enabled channel is clicked. Next we have set data types. If we click on this button, this view will allow us to configure the data types in each connector in our channel. We'll go over this in more detail later. Next we can see our clear global channel maps on deploy. So if this is checked, then all global channel mappings will be cleared out whenever a channel is redeployed. We'll talk more about channel mappings in a later lesson. Next we'll go to the Set Dependency button. If we click on this, we can see different code template libraries, library resources, and deploy and start dependencies. I know I haven't talked about these at all, so we'll get into those in a later lesson. Click out of that. And next we see an initial state. So this determines what state the channel will be in after it's deployed. This is key if you want to always have a channel start on deploy. Some of the values are started, paused, and stopped. So when you set the channel to started, the entire channel will be started. So this means that the source and destination connector will be enabled and running. So the source will pick up new messages and the destinations will send out messages. The next one is paused. For paused, only the destination connectors will be started. So if the channel is queued with messages, then the channel will not accept any new messages, but will allow the queued messages to send. Next we have stopped. Neither the source or destination connector will process messages, so there will be no traffic going through the channel at all. Okay, next we have the attachment handler. So this determines how the channel will extract and store attachments. If we do the drop down, we can see different attachment handlers. Each handler stores attachments in different ways, and we'll look at this later on. Next we have the Store Attachments checkbox. If this is checked, any attachments that are extracted will be stored in the database and available to reattach. If it's not checked, then no attachments will be stored. Next we have the channel tags. So this is a list of channel tags included with the channel. So we can type into the text box to add different tags. So say we wanted just a listener tag on here. We can type in listener and then click enter, and that created that tag for this channel. And then we can later use this tag in other channels as well. Now when we just created a tag, it chooses a color at random. We can change this color in the settings view. Let me save my channel and go to settings, and we can go to the tags tab, and you can see here we have our listener and which channel it's associated with. So say we want to choose maybe green. Click OK, and then save. And then if we go back to our channel, you can see there's a tag, and it's green. Now we can choose to do multiple tags. You can just do the text and then enter, save changes. Next we have the ID. So this ID is just going to be the channel ID that we can use to just copy and paste somewhere, including like the Mirth API or just a notepad. Next we have revisions. So this is going to be how many times the channel has been revised. Next we have last modified. So this is going to be the last date we successfully modified a channel and saved it. Okay, next we'll go down to the message storage setting groups. So this is where we can change everything about how Mirth stores, encrypts, and removes our messages. So there's a few different stages we can put the slider in. So the first stage is going to be development. This is going to be the default whenever you create a channel, and it's just going to store all of the data in our channel. So this includes all the content, which is all the messages, the metadata, so if there's any dates or any IDs, or if there's any channel maps or global maps, then all that will be stored. So next is a durable message delivery. This shows whether the durable message delivery is enabled or disabled. If enabled, unfinished messages will automatically be recovered and processed if the channel gets halted or if the server suddenly goes down for any reason. Next we have performance. So this just shows a relative estimation of performance for each storage option. When storage is disabled, performance is the highest and at the cost of not having durable message delivery or the ability to view messages in the message browser. Next we have the encrypt message content. So if enabled, content will be stored in the database encrypted. Messages that are stored while this option is enabled will still be viewable in the message browser, but the content will not be searchable. So next is remove content on completion. Remove content on completion removes message contents once the message has completed processing. This isn't applicable for messages that are errored or queued. If filtered only is also checked, only content for the filtered connector message will be removed. Lastly, we have remove attachments on completion. So whenever a channel and a message has finished processing the message and sending it off, it'll just remove all the attachments associated to that message. This usually doesn't happen for error messages or queued messages. So if we look at this slider and we pull it down to production, we can see content is only going to keep the raw, encoded, sent, the response, and maps. Then it's going to keep everything else the same. The next one down is raw. So only the raw source map content and attachments will be stored. Destination queuing is not supported in this mode, but source queuing is still supported. The next one is just metadata. So we only want to save the metadata for that channel and those messages. So no message content actually gets saved and stored. Only the metadata. So the source and destination queuings don't happen with metadata. And then next we just have disabled. So no messages, metadata, content, or attachments will be stored, and source and destination queuing are not supported either. So next we have the message pruning. These settings allow you to decide when to prune and archive messages if we want to at all. Pruning doesn't happen automatically unless we enable the scheduler in the Data Pruner Settings tab. So if we go to Settings, and we go to the Data Pruner, we can see that our current state is not running. So if we enable the scheduler, we can set a schedule type. It's going to be an interval, a time, or maybe a cron job, and we can set an interval. So if we save this and we go back to our channel, then down here our message pruning will actually be running appropriately. So the first thing we have is metadata. So if there's any metadata we want to store, or if we want to delete, then we can set those options here. So the default is just to store it indefinitely. So it's going to save it on our Mirth database forever, at least until we delete it ourselves. If we set prune metadata older than so many days, we can set Maybe we want to get rid of metadata after 30 days. Maybe you want to do 1 day. Next we have content. So this is just going to be like the content of your messages. So this would be a raw, encoded, maybe a response. And we can set that to print content older than 1 day. We can do 30 days, 300. So the next is allow message archiving. So if this is checked and the data printer and archiver are enabled, messages in the channel will be archived first before being pruned. Next, let's go down to the custom metadata group and table. This table shows us metadata that's also searchable in the message browser. As messages are processed through the channel, these columns are populated from the variable maps using a configurable map key. So for example, let's say we wanted to have the ability to search for a message depending on a patient's ID. So let's go into a channel that accepts just HL7 messages. So we'll go into channel 2. You can see this is a channel reader. So we can see that there's source and type, but we want to add a column for MRNs, or the patient ID. So if we go to the source and we go to edit transformer, and we'll add a step, and this step is going to be a mapper type, and we're going to want to put an MRN for our variable. So this is going to save whatever mapping we have to the MRN channel map variable, and we want to get the PID 3.1 field. So if this works, we should be able to save our channel and run a new message in to this channel and see the channel variable for a message, and it should have the MRN value. So let's reprocess a message. So let's open up source. So if we go and see which value we should get PID 3. So 1, 2, 3. We should get 583295. So we can go to the mappings tab, and for channel map MRN, we have 583295. So that's what we need. However, it's not showing up right here. That's because we still need to set that in our custom metadata table columns. So let's go back to our channel 2. And so now let's go over to our custom metadata, and we'll add a new row, and we'll say the name is going to be MRN, and we can set it to a string, and we'll do MRN because this is what matches what's in our source transformer. Okay, we'll save changes, and let's deploy the channel again. And we'll need to reprocess a message. So now you can see MRN showed up right here. And we can go in here to advanced and click on new metadata. And now we have MRN for something we can search. So if we wanted to search for just that value, we could say MRN equals 583295. Click out of that and then OK, and search, and now we have just that message. So the next group is going to be the channel description. So this is pretty self-explanatory. We can set a description for a channel. So this is just a random description, and we can set anything in here. Note, if you set a description in your channel, you're also able to filter channels in the channel view. So let's save this. And so now if I go into channel, I can do Control F, and I can say random. And you can see that channel 2 was found. and it didn't find anything else. Next, we'll be looking at the Source tab and different source connectors we can use. But before we step into the Source tab and look at the different source connectors, let's go over a brief overview of the map Mirth uses when processing a message. Typically, we would use Mirth to retrieve, process, manipulate, and send different messages and message types, as we can see in our diagram. But for this lesson, we'll look at the connection between the sending device and our Mirth server. Specifically, we'll be looking at the inbound source connectors and the many different ways we can use to retrieve messages. In order to load messages into a Mirth channel, we first need a source connector. Like the name suggests, the source connector interacts with the source, whether this be another server, file system, API, and more. So there are a number of different source connector types that Mirth comes with that we can take advantage of. Some of the ones commonly used are a TCP connector, so this can be an MLLP or basic TCP VPN connection with an IP and port. Note that this only allows Mirth to listen for messages, not read them. Next, we have a database reader, so we can connect to a database and grab messages via custom SQL scripts. Another commonly used one is a file reader. So this could be a connection to an internal file system, FTP server, or an AWS S3 bucket. Another one is a JavaScript Reader. So we can create custom JavaScript code to retrieve messages and send it through our channel. So now that we went through a brief intro of source connectors, let's look and go through all the different connectors and their settings. So before we dive into each connector type, let's just look at a specific setting that each connector shares. This is going to be the source settings. And we can find this under the source tab in its own group. So if we go to the source tab, look for a group called source settings, we can find these different settings here. So these are some settings that we can configure for the source queue, the response, batch processing, and maximum threads. So to start out, we'll look at the source queue. We can have the channel configured to start a queue, or if we want to first process the messages sequentially and send a response as soon as it's in the source connector. So there's two options. There's off and there's on. So for off, if we select this option, we can process the message before sending the response to the sending device. And this is the default option. If we select on, selecting on will queue messages and immediately send a response. So if there are any failures, then the sending device will not be aware. We'll skip over queue buffer size and we'll go to response. So this option determines what response we want to send back to the sending device. We can decide to have a few different places return the response. And this can be in the destinations, the post processor, or the source connector. So if we want multiple options for the response, then we'll need to set the source queue to be off. So this will allow us to look at the dropdown and see the many different options we have for the response. So if we select one of the auto-generate options to send a response, then that'll take our inbound data type that we specified in the data types window and send a response using that data type. There's also a few other options we have if we want to use this option. So we can do before processing. So what this is going to do is going to generate the response before the channel processes the message. We can do after source transformer. So this is going to send a response after the channel processes the message in the source transformer. And we also have destinations completed. So we can generate the response after the destination connector has processed the message, and we can either send a response based on the status of the message. So this could be error, queued, sent, or filtered. We also have the option to do post processor. So whenever the post processor is finished, it'll send a response. Or when the destination 1 is finished, it'll send a response, or any of the other destinations that we have specified. These are all the destinations I have set up in our channel too. Next, let's go to queue buffer size. So this is only enabled if we have the source queue on. This is because this option allows us to specify how many different messages are held in memory on our Mirth server when creating a queue. So the default is 1,000. So if we had no queue, then we wouldn't need a queue buffer size. But if we wanted to limit the memory that is stored for this channel, then we can set this to lower, or if we need it higher, then we can set it to higher. Note that the queue still stays in there, and say we have 10,000 messages, it's still going to stay with 10,000 messages, but only 1,000 of them are in memory. Next we'll go down to the radio options for process batch. This option allows us to enable batch processing. So for example, if this channel accepts messages with multiple messages in the original message, then we can set this to yes to process those messages in that batch. I'll talk more about batch processing in the advanced Mirth Connect course. Next we'll go down to the batch response. If we want to send a response either at the start or the last of the processing the batch messages, we can select first or last. So when the first message is being processed, it'll send a response, or if we want to wait until the sending device that the last message has been processed, then we can send a response then. Next we'll go down to max processing threads. Lastly, this option gives us the ability to select a maximum number of messages to process at the same time. And by default, this is set to 1. But if we were to set this higher, then the order of messages are not guaranteed. So if you need your messages to process in sequential order, I suggest just to leave this default to 1. However, if you wanted to maximize the channel performance and the throughput, and you don't care about the message order, then increase this value. One of the most basic connector types, and the default Mirth has, is what's called a channel reader. As the name suggests, the connector will simply sit and wait for any traffic from another channel and then process the message it receives. This can especially be useful if your process needs to split message workflow into multiple channels. So one of the use cases for a channel reader is if we have an existing channel that receives messages from an external IPM port, but we need to send the same message to different places and transform the data uniquely to that location. We can then add 2 channels with the source connector as a channel reader, and then we can transform each message uniquely, then we can send the message off to the location. So say the message needs to be sent to a hospital and be stored in a database. We can create 2 channel readers that transforms the data for each location, and one sends to the hospital and one sends to the database. Note that we don't have to make our source connector a channel reader if we want to send messages to the channel using a channel writer. Any of the source connectors can read in messages via channel writer. So now let's look at how to configure this connector. So in order to attach a channel reader to our channel, all we need to do is to go into the source tab of our channel and make sure the connector type is assigned to channel reader. Besides the source settings, there are no other settings we can configure for a channel reader. As you can see down here, channel reader settings, no configurable settings. It's as simple as that. In the next few lessons, we'll be going over the more complex reader connectors. So these are going to be the database reader, the file reader, and the JavaScript reader. But before we get into these, they all do not passively listen for messages, but instead they run on a specific schedule. And because of this, they all share a settings called polling settings. Now polling settings allow a connector to actively poll according to a specific schedule. So this could be every few seconds, minutes, or hours. Or this could be a specific interval, time, or a cron job, which is more advanced, and we'll go over that in our advanced course. So just a specific example. We have our channel reader. So for our channel reader, usually we have a sending device and a channel. And the sending device actively pushes messages to our channel reader, and our channel reader is passively open. So then our channel reader will send off to any destination we need, maybe a hospital. But for a channel that's a reader, and has polling settings, we have a read device. So this could be a database, a file system, or any other read device. So we have our channel with polling settings, and our channel with polling settings has an interval for when we want to poll. So we'll ask the read device to send us back either files or records, and it'll send us back those files and records on an interval. So then we can send it off to our hospital. Now let's go into Mirth Connect and look at the polling settings. So in order to look at the polling settings for a connector, we first need to select either a database reader, file reader, or JavaScript reader. So let's create a new channel. And we'll call this polling settings channel. And we'll go into our source tab, and instead of having a channel reader, we'll select either a file reader, database reader, or a JavaScript reader. Let's select a file reader, and we can see now below we have our polling settings. The first setting we can look at is a schedule type. So this is going to give us the ability to use what type of polling schedule we want to set. So this can be an interval, a time, or a cron job, which is a custom expression. So let's select an interval, and below we can now see a setting called interval. This gives us the ability to poll on a specific interval, whether that be every so milliseconds, seconds, minutes, or hours. So note, if we select hours, the maximum hour we can set is 23 hours. Note, if we try to set 24 hours, and we save our changes, we get an error. So let's set this back to 23 hours. So next to our unit drop-down, we can see a wrench icon. This is going to give us the ability to add more advanced settings. So this can be choosing a specific day, month, or time range to poll. So if we wanted to poll every business day from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., then we can select Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. and click OK. So now if we have that saved, then we can see next to the schedule type, we can see the next time our channel will attempt to poll. If we choose time as a schedule type, we can click yes to change. Then we can choose a specific time, maybe every day at 5 p.m. And we also have the same advanced settings. The last type is a cron job expression. I won't get into specific cron jobs in this lesson, but just note that this can be very handy if we want to poll at more than one specific time. So if I need this channel to poll every day at 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., then we can use a cron job expression to accomplish this. The last setting I didn't go over is poll once on start. So if we select yes to poll once on start, then every time our channel is started, then the channel will poll regardless of our interval set. This can come in handy if we want to test our channel every time we attempt to start it. So whether this is deploying it or just manually starting it in our dashboard view. The next connector we'll talk about is the database reader. With the database reader, we can connect to an external database and perform a query to get selected rows in a database and convert them to messages so our channel can process them. We can also run an additional SQL statement either after each row or all rows have been processed, and this could update our database table or run other statements. So when running the database reader, all results will be first converted into XML, where each column is a separate node. So let's go ahead and look at the database reader connector now. So first let's go ahead and create a new channel, and we'll label this database reader. Let's go to our source tab, and we'll change the connector type to database reader. Now we've already looked at the polling settings and the source settings, but we have a new database reader settings group now. So let's go through some of those properties. The first property is the database driver. So the database driver is going to be essentially the type of the database you want to connect to. The default ones Mirth comes with is MySQL, Oracle, Postgres database, SQL Server Sybase, Microsoft SQL Server, and SQLite. Or you could have your own custom SQL type that you can import. Note to the right of the drop-down, you can specify your own driver using the wrench icon. So here we can add our own driver, but this is more advanced and we'll save that for the advanced course. So we'll close this. And for this lesson, we'll use the Microsoft SQL Server. So next we'll look at the database URL. This is going to contain the URL for your database. So if we click the Insert URL template, it will generate the connection string for us with placeholders for the host, the port, and a database name. I have a database I'm going to interact with in this lesson, so I'm going to enter in my connections here. Next we have the username and password properties. These will just be the username and password you want to connect to your database. I'll enter in them right now. So now that I have my username and password, we'll go ahead and skip over the rest of the properties and go to the SQL property. So this is where we can enter in our own custom SQL with what tables and columns we want to pull. If we go to the far right, we can see a button called Select. If we click this button, a window where we can select different tables will appear. So we can filter out these tables by adding in our table name. So for this example, I have a database and I have a table in there called Fake Patients. So I'm going to enter in Fake Patients, and then in order to populate, I can click Get Tables. So we can now click on each column we want our connector to query for. We'll just select all of them for this example. So we can click on Fake Patients and include. That's going to include them all. However, if we wanted to just get rid of one, then we can click each individual checkbox. Once you're done, you can click Generate, and our custom SQL script will be in our SQL property. We can now edit this query if we'd like. So say we want to just get all patients where they haven't been processed. So I'm going to add in a where clause here, where processed equals 0. 0 essentially means false. So we're going to get all fake patients where they haven't been processed. And processed is a column in my database table, as we can see over here. So now we can deploy this and see what gets returned. So we'll save changes and deploy. So we can go into our table and see the different messages that appeared. So we click on the first message, we can see how this generated an XML with our results. So it has our result, and then our fake patient's ID, first name, last name, email, gendered, and if it was processed. And it did this for each one of our rows in our database. So now let's look at some of the other properties I haven't discussed. So we left off at SQL. We'll skip over Use JavaScript and go to Keep Connection Open. So if this setting is set to yes, then our connector will use the same database connection each time the query is ran. If no, then the connection will be closed after all the rows have finished processing. Next we'll look at Aggregate Results. This will tell the connector we want to take all selected results, and instead of splitting them into their own messages, they're combined into one message. So let's click yes, and yes, and then let's save our changes and deploy. So now if we click into our database reader and look at our first message, so we can see how all of our rows have been combined into one message. And these are all the fake patients that haven't been processed. So let's go back to our channel. And next we'll look at the cache results. Note that cache results is only editable if our aggregate results is no. For cache results, this will cache our entire results into memory until it starts processing our messages. If we don't cache the entire results, Then we can specify how many rows we want to retrieve while processing our messages with the fetch size property. Next we have number of retried on error. So we can set this property to a number for how many number of tries we want to execute our SQL if any error occurs while attempting a query. So this could be a failed query, or it could be an authentication attempt. This works alongside retry interval, which will tell the connector how long to wait until we retry the connection again. So this value is in milliseconds. So if we want 1 second, then we'll need to put 1000. But the default is 10 seconds. So that is 10,000. Next we have encoding, which we can set to convert any of our binary data into messages. You can see there are a number of options, but selecting the right one will depend on your requirements. Usually the default is just fine. Lastly, let's look at run post process SQL. So we can select never if we don't want to run a query after processing, or we can run a query after each message processed, or we can run it after all messages have been processed. So this is especially useful if we want to update our database. So we can add update fake patients, and we can set processed to be equal to true, where ID equals, so we want our ID of our patient. So in order to do this, we can go to the right and see the different columns that are in our message. Note it gets this when we select our table and columns, as we did before. So we can drag fake patient's ID over to our SQL statement. In this way, we can reference the row by its ID so we can update our database. For this example, I just want to get the top 10 rows so we can update patients 10 by 10. So we'll save changes and we'll deploy. And now it's started. So we'll check our messages and we'll see each one of these patients. Now if we go to a database and we select all from fake patients, we can see all the patients we processed. So we can see that patient ID 13 is in our Mirth and it's been processed. So if we go and run this channel again, we'll stop it and start. We can see that it's going to run through another 10 patients, and our next patient is 23. So if we go back to our database, we can select all from fake patients again. We can see that the last patient that's been processed is 23. The last property we want to look at is use JavaScript. So if we click yes for use JavaScript, it's going to update these SQL statements into actual JavaScript that we can run. This will be very useful if we want to create multiple different select statements and aggregate them all into our results. And the same process is for the run post process script. So you can see there's a JavaScript here as well, and the same radio buttons that we can use. So the next connector we'll talk about is a file reader. This connector essentially reads files from a local or remote directory. So this could be multiple different protocols. So we could read files from a local files, an FTP server, an SFTP server, use an SMB, WebDAV, or an AWS S3 bucket. These protocols allow us to read the files and interact with the file system. After we get the files into our channel, the connector can run a few different options to delete the original files on the file system, rename them, or move them. So this connector can be especially helpful if we have a client that hosts all of their files on an SFTP server. We can pull down the files and then move them to their archive folder while processing them in Mirth. So let's look at an example. Let's say we have a client who is using a file system, maybe an SFTP server. So we can create a file reader where we can request the files and then we can download the files from the file system. After we loaded the files, we can delete them, rename them, or move the files, and then we can send or break down the files into our database. So now let's look into Mirth and see how we can do this. So before we get into the details of the file reader connector, I set up an S3 bucket with just a few test files we can look at. This will give us the chance to go through all the abilities the file reader can do. Note that this is an S3 bucket, but all the same principles apply. Whether you're accessing a file directory through an SFTP server, local directory, or another file system. So let's go through some of the files I've uploaded to my S3 bucket. So we have a .getignore file, a CSV file, a text file, another text file, and an HL7 file. We also have a subdirectory in our main directory. This includes just a test file. With these, we're going to be able to see the different options we have for our connector. So let's go ahead and create a new channel, and we'll label it File Reader. Then we'll go to our Source tab, and we'll make sure to change the connector type to a file reader. Now let's go ahead and set the polling settings to poll every 23 hours. And we'll poll once on start. This way, when we deploy our channel, we won't be spammed by 5-second intervals. Next, we'll notice that we have a new settings group called File Reader Settings. The first property I want to talk about is the method. So if we select the drop-down, we can see the many different method types Mirth Connect supports. The first one is the file method. So this could be a local file system where your Mirth instance is located. Or it could be a network file share or a mapped share. Next we have FTP, and this would be a file transfer server. Along the same lines we have an SFTP, which would be a secure file transfer with the default port at 22. So if we need to use a different port, then we could enter that into our URL text box. Next we have an Amazon S3 bucket, which is what we'll be demoing today. And then we have an SMB, which is going to be a server message block. Typically this is used when applications are attempting to connect to a file system using Active Directory. And lastly we have WebDAV. This will allow us to retrieve and move documents on a server over HTTPS. Next to the drop-down we have a test read. This can be used to make sure your file reader connector can connect to your file system you want to connect to. So the next property we want to look at is the directory and the URL property. The directory property is just enabled for the file method. So if we go and try to use it for FTP, we can see that it's grayed out. Now the URL property is enabled for all other method types. It may just have a different label depending on the different method you're using. So for example, FTP has FTP, and an SFTP would have SFTP. For this example, we're going to use an Amazon S3 bucket, and I'm going to enter in our bucket name. So this is Learning Mirth Connect. So depending on the different method, we can enter in an IP or a domain name. Next to the URL box, we have a subdirectory field, and we can add any other subdirectories we want to navigate to. So for example, I want to go into the test files subdirectory on my bucket. We'll skip over file name filter pattern, and we'll go to include all subdirectories. So here we can see if we want to include all subdirectories on our URL. For now, we'll keep this at no, so we can only pull the files in our test file directory. So we can ignore the rest of the properties until we get to anonymous. So for my S3 bucket, I need to enter in access key ID and a secret access key. So we'll set this to no, and I'll go ahead and enter in my access key ID and my secret access key. Note if we're like a SFTP server, this would update with user and password. For the user and password combo, you need to authenticate to your server. So now that we have our credentials, we can click Test Read in order to see if we can connect. So I can successfully connect. So now down below, we can see that we have a few options for what to do after processing a file, after an error has occurred. We'll just go ahead and leave those as their default values, and let's go ahead and run our channel. So we'll save our changes and deploy. Now we can see in our channel 4 different files that we picked up from our S3 bucket. So we can see that we picked up our test2 file, our test file, our HL7 file, and our CSV file. If we go back to our S3 bucket, we can see those files. So you can see that we got our CSV, our text file, our test2 text file, our test HL7 file, but we didn't get .getignore or another subdirectory. So if we go back to our channel, we can see that we didn't get our .getignore file because we set the property ignore.files to yes. So this will ignore all files that start with a period. Usually these are configuration files that don't need to be used. It also didn't get our subdirectory because we set that to no. So let's go ahead and set include all subdirectories to yes, and set ignore files to no. So this should get our subdirectory with all our files in that subdirectory and our getignore file. So let's go ahead and save changes and deploy. We'll go ahead and go back to our messages and see what all it picked up. So you can see we started off right here. So we got our test2 file, we got our test file, we got our HL7 file, we got our CSV, and then we also got 2 other files. We got our getignore file, and also we got our another test file. So if we wanted to see the file names in the file directory they were located at, we can go to the Mappings tab, and down below we can see the original file name and where the file was at. So you can see this was in our Learning Mirth Connect folder, Test Files folder, and Test Subdirectory folder. And our file name is test.txt. If we go down to 9, you can see we got a .getignore file with our file directory as Learning Mirth Connect /test files. So if we go back to our channel, we can see a few different other properties. We can see the timeout property, which is going to be how long you want to try to connect to the server. So the next few properties we want to look at is what we can do after we've processed our messages. So let's look at the after processing action. This by default is set to none. So this will just leave the file in the location it was picked up. However, we can also select move and delete. So if we want to just move it to a folder, we can say move and then put our directory in this field. Also, if we want to just change the file name, then we can leave directory field empty and just set our file name to what we want to rename it. And then I'll keep the same directory that it was pulled from. Also for these fields, we can specify any template substitution we want to include in the folder or file name. So we can see those to the right. We can drag and drop these into our fields, and it'll pick up any substitutions we may want to add. So let's say we want to move a file when it's processed to the test subdirectory folder in our S3 bucket. So we can label it Learn Mirth Connect /test files test subdirectory. And if we want to rename it, we can specify what name in the move to file name field. So let's say we want to rename it to processed _ and then its original file name. So we can say processed _ and then we can drag and drop the original file name into the move to file name field. Another field we may want to look at before we deploy this is the file name filter pattern. So by default, it has a star. So this is just going to get all files in that directory. So for this example, let's just pick up the file test2.txt. And we'll set our include all subdirectories to no. Now our file reader should get test2.txt in the test files folder. So now let's go back to our S3 bucket. So now our connector should get the test2.txt file, and after processed, it should move it to the test subdirectory folder and have it be named processed_test2.txt. So let's go ahead and run that channel. We'll save and deploy. Go into our channel, and we can see the file that we picked up was the test2.txt in the Learning Mirth Connect /test files directory. So now if we go back into our S3 bucket, we should see that test2 has been renamed to process_test2.txt and put into the test subdirectory folder. So we're now in the test subdirectory folder. So if we refresh this, we now see the process_test2.txt. If we go back to the test files folder, we can see that test2.txt is no longer here. Now let's try to delete a file after processing. We can do this by selecting delete in the after processing action, and no changes are needed in the fields below. But let's try to delete the patients.csv file. So in file name filter pattern, we'll do patients.csv. Save and deploy our changes. So we go to our first record. We can see that it picked up the CSV, and let's see if it deleted the file from our S3 bucket. So we now have our S3 bucket. So let's just reload, and we can see that patients have been deleted. Now let's go through some of the other properties. So let's look at the error reading action. This will do the same as the after processing action, but this will be for any files that have failed to be read in. So for example, this could be an out-of-memory error or our network connection drops. We can select move and delete for this property and enter in the folder and file name below, just as we have with the after processing action. We also have the error in response action. So we have the same options, move and delete, but this will trigger if we get a response when our status has an error. So this option is only available if we have the process bash option in our source settings disabled. So if we have any errors, then we can use these properties to save those to an error folder to reprocess later when we can fix the errors. Next we have the check file age option. So this works with the file age. If check file age is enabled, then it will only get files older than the file age. The file age is in milliseconds. So say if we want all files that are older than 60 seconds, then we can put in 60,000 into file age and enable check file age. Next we have the file size option. This is going to be the minimum and maximum size of files we want to process. So we can enter in 0, or if we unclick ignore maximum, we can enter in a maximum size. So this is going to be in bytes. If we have the ignore maximum option checked, then we'll get all files above the minimum value. We can also use the sort file by option to order the files in the option we select. So we can select date, name, and size. For date, this is going to get all the files from the oldest last modification date first. The size of the files is going to be the smallest first. And by name, this would be from A to Z. Next we can use file type to select the contents of our file. So if we have a binary file, such as images or PDFs, then we can specify that here by clicking on binary. The default is text for any files with regular text as their contents. Using this will encode the data using the specified character set, which is down below. So if text is enabled for our file type, then we can choose a specific encoding to be used for reading the contents of our file. Now let's look at some of the grayed out options up here, namely the secure mode. This option is only available if we are using a WebDAV connection. So if we change our method to WebDAV, you can see that it now is enabled. So if we have this enabled, it will allow us to use HTTPS instead of HTTP. So if we click no, then it's going to use HTTP, and yes, HTTPS. We can see this up here in our URL. Next we have passive mode and validate connection. This is only available for our FTP method. So let's change to FTP. And you can see now passive mode and validate connection is available. For passive mode, if we enable this, then the server decides what port the client should connect to for their data. This mode will sometimes allow a connection through a firewall that normal mode wouldn't. This is because the client is initiating the connection and not the server. Finally, for validate connection, the connector will validate the connection before every operation. So this could be every read, write, or delete. The next and last reader source connector we'll talk about is the JavaScript Reader. So the JavaScript Reader can make your Mirth instance so powerful and can be used in a wide variety of ways. So this could include calling Java libraries, creating custom reader connectors, return messages, or just use the connector to run code at a certain interval using the source connector. Some of the return values we can send to our channel is a string, so this is going to be returned as one message. We can return a raw message, so this could contain message data and map variables. We can also return a list, so this is going to be a Java list that will return each list value as its own message. We can return an empty string, so we can only run the code in the JavaScript Reader. Or we could return any object, and the object will be converted to a string using the .toString method and be sent as one message to our channel. This connector is limitless in the ways you can configure it, since you have the ability to write whatever code you want to execute. So I'm going to highlight some of the basic examples and functions and how to return messages, but I will cover specific ways to use this connector in my Mirth Connect Advanced course. After this lesson, you'll have a clear understanding of how you can use the principles of the JavaScript Reader and return multiple different types of messages. Now let's get into it. So to start out, let's create a new channel and we'll call it a JavaScript Reader. We'll go to our Source tab and we'll select the JavaScript Reader as our connector type. So for this connector type, we have our pull settings and our source settings, as well as the new JavaScript Reader settings. Let's go ahead before we work on the reader settings. We'll set our interval to poll on start, and we'll change our interval to 23 hours. So we can see down here at the bottom the JavaScript Reader settings. Note that Mirth uses a JavaScript and Java hybrid called a Rhino. This allows us to run JavaScript in Java, so we can access most of the JavaScript utilities and Java packages. Before we get started, I want to show a handy tool that we can use to print some logs to our logger. So if we go into our Java code, we can write logger dot, and then we can see a whole bunch of different options down here. We can use debug, and we can add a message to print out. When you're working on your code, you can use this to debug some of your code. As Mirth doesn't have a debugger, this has come in handy several times because I can essentially add log statements to each line of my code in order to see what broke. So we save that and deploy it. We can see that we got a log test, exactly what we wanted. So let's go back to JavaScript Reader. And we'll delete this, And we can go ahead and start out with the most basic type we can return. So this is going to be a string. So all we need to do is write return and then any string we want. We could use double quotes or we could use single quotes. So let's return just a basic test message and we'll deploy and run our channel. So we can see now we have a message with the contents test. So we'll go back to our channel and say we want something more useful. Say we want a CSV. So you can see I have my CSV and we have a carriage return in order to break the lines down. So this is just going to return an ID, first name, last name, email, and then some data. So this is just going to be John Doe and his email. So let's go ahead and save and deploy. Now we can see in here we have two messages. The first one was our test message we ran before, and our second one is our CSV. So this was pretty basic. So we could create a few objects and a loop to add this data into an XML. And then we can see how the JavaScript Reader turns this into an object and prints out the message. So as you can see with my code, I have an array called patients with another array with John Doe and Jane Doe. So with this we can create an XML string called rows, and we can loop through each patient in our patients array, and we can add it to an XML. Patient and then ID, first name, last name, email, and then patient, and then to end our XML string. And then we can return our XML. And we can now see our message that has an XML. So now let's turn this into an XML object. So as you can see below, I still have my patients array, but instead I created an XML object with rows, and then I looped through our patients again and added another patient XML object, and then I'm adding a property to each of the patient objects called ID, first name, last name, email, and then their respective columns. And I add it back to the XML under patient with the new patient XML. And then I'm going to return our XML object. So note that this wasn't a string, but since our JavaScript Reader can interpret this as XML.toString, it will return just the message exactly like we had before. So we'll save changes and deploy. We can see now that we have the same result, but it's actually an XML object. So like any good Java or JavaScript code, we can add comments as well. So in order to do this, we'll add a new line, and we can put a // we can add our comment. So let's say new XML object for rows. We can also do a multi-line comment by doing /* and then */. Here we can write multiple lines of comments, and you can see below that each one of these are commented out. So what if we wanted to return each patient as its own message? So we can do that using a Java list. So like our last example, I have our patients array again, but now I have an array list. So we can access Java packages using the Java dot and then the package name and then its type. This is specific to your Java version, so these locations could be different. So then for our example, I'm looking through all the patients and still make it into an XML, but instead I'm adding it to our array list. And then we're returning M, which is our messages. So what this should do is this should create an XML for each one of these patients, but instead send it through as two individual messages. And now we can see our first message is Jane, and then our second message is John, and they're both split out. So the next one we want to look at is if we just want to run the code and not return any messages. So we can do this by simply just deleting the variable that we want to return. We can just say return. We can see that we haven't had any new messages returned. It just ran our code. So our last way we can return messages using the JavaScript Reader is returning raw messages. So a raw message can either dispatch just a message, or it can dispatch a message to a certain destination or destinations, or it can add some mappings as well. We'll go over mappings later, but I'll show you a little bit in this example. So I have my example now, and we can see that we're just returning a CSV like we did in our first example, and just returning that message to our channel. So let's save, deploy. We can see now that we just have our CSV. However, what if we just wanted to dispatch it to just one destination? So we can go to our channel, and instead of having the raw message in the CSV, we can add a parameter, and this is going to be an array with our destination ID. So for this example, I have 1 because our destination ID is 1. So if we save our changes and deploy, we see that our message has returned to the destination 1. However, what if we had 2 destinations, and we just wanted to return it to destination 2? We'll go to our destinations and just add a blank destination. Then we can go back to our source, and instead of returning 1, we can return 2. So now we should see that the message just went to destination 2. And as you can see below, we just sent it to destination 2. So what if we had a destination in here that wasn't actually created? So maybe we have destination 3. So save changes, deploy, and we can see now there's no destinations it's been dispatched to. So it didn't even go to a destination. So let's look at adding mappings into our raw message. So this can send mappings to our destination, so our destination can get access to certain mappings. So now we can see that I have one patient up here, John Doe, and I've added a JSON with some mappings. We have patient ID, returning John's patient ID, and his first name. So down below we can see our raw message with our CSV, with our patient's ID, comma, first name, comma, last name, comma, email. And we're sending it to the first destination, and then we're adding these mappings in. So for these mappings, all we need to do is add a JSON with a identifier, and then the value we want to return. And then we'll return our message. And we can see now that we have our message, and it's our CSV, but now we have our mappings, and that shows our first name, John, and our patient ID, 0. The next source connectors we'll be talking about is the listeners. The listeners, besides the JMS listener, share a settings called listener settings. These settings are shown when the connector is a TCP socket based listener, and we can specify the local interface and port to listen to. So I have a channel with a TCP listener as the source connector. This allows us to see the listener settings. The first property we can look at is a local address option. We can either enable all interfaces to listen on all interfaces, or we can select the specific interface we want to listen in the specific interface address given in the field. Usually selecting enable all interfaces is okay. Next we have the local port. This is going to be the TCP port on which to listen for connections. So we can specify in our Mirth channel to accept all data to this channel for all IPs on port 6661, and I would typically use any IP higher than 1024 and not any well-known ports. The next source connector we will talk about is the TCP Listener. This connector listens for messages coming in over a TCP connection, which can either be a TCP IP import and wait for clients to connect, or we can connect to an external server. There are a few options we can set for this connector. We can decide when to keep our connection open and how many clients can connect at once. We can also tell the connector how to send responses, and we can choose to send the data back on the same connection or a new connection. This connector type is very common if you have other networks or applications trying to send messages to your channel. Say we have another Mirth interface on a different hospital network. If a VPN is set up to communicate with our network, we can simply add a TCP Listener channel and give them our IP and port specified for the channel, and they can start sending us messages through a TCP interface. So let's look at an example. Say we have a sending device that wants to connect to our server through a TCP connection. We can set up our TCP listener to listen for messages coming over the IP and port and send responses back to the sending device. We can then filter and transform the message and send to our hospital or database. Now let's look at how to configure this connector and the different options we have. So let's create a new channel and label it TCP Listener. And we'll set the connector as the TCP Listener. Down below we can see a new setting called TCP Listener Settings. Here is where we configure how our TCP Listener handles requests and responses. So before we get into settings, let's keep our local port at 6661 for all interfaces. And the first property we'll talk about is a transmission mode. This will allow us to determine how we are going to receive our data and how we're going to send our messages back. So we can see the default value is MLLP. MLLP stands for Minimum Lower Layer Protocol. MLLP uses standards that determine where a message starts and stops. MLLP was made for healthcare related data and sending it between interfaces. So we can also use just basic TCP. And we can see some different settings to the side here, where we want to start the message and where we want to stop it. Now if we go down to sample frame, this is going to show us an example of a valid incoming message format. If we switch to MLLP, we can see MLLP sample frame. Next we have mode. We can select if we're the server that's listening for connections, or we can select if we're the client connecting to a TCP server. Note if we switch to client mode, then our listener settings will only be used if override local bindings below is set to enabled. If we have client enabled, then remote address, remote port, override local bindings, and reconnect interval are now enabled. So we can use remote address to specify the domain name or the IP to which we can connect to. And we can specify which port we want to connect to using remote port. Now override local bindings allow us to override the local address and port the client socket is bound to. If we use no, the default value will be 0.0.0.0 and a local port of 0. If a local port is 0, then the OS will assign a ephemeral port automatically, which just means it'll last just for a short period of time. Now reconnect interval is used to specify how long we want to wait before disconnecting from the TCP server and connecting again. This is going to be in milliseconds, so the default value is 5 seconds. If we switch back to server mode, then max connections is now enabled. This will allow us to accept the maximum amount of clients, and after we have the maximum of clients connected, then the connector will reject any subsequent connections until it goes below our maximum. Next we have receive timeout. Receive timeout will wait a specified amount of time after receiving a message before we close out the connection. Buffer size is used to determine the maximum size of messages we want to receive. Generally the default is fine. If we want to close the connection after we finish processing the message, we can select no for keep connection open. If we leave it on yes, then our connection between Mirth and the client will remain open until the client closes the connection. We can select the data type coming in using the data type option. If it's a text, we can use the encoding to encode the message in a particular format. Next we'll get into how we respond to a message. So we can use respond on new connection to always send a response on new connections using our response address and response port below. Or we can select no to send only responses using the same connection the message is received on. So that'll send back to the IP and port that we received the message. We can also select message recovery to send responses on new connections during message recovery. So let's go over a demo and look at the different mappings we have access to. So before we get into our demo, I set up another channel called Client Sender. And all this does is we can send an HL7 message to a destination, and our destination is set up to our local instance and the port we specified earlier on. Now I just sent an HL7 message in to our TCP Listener using our Client Sender channel, and you can see that we got a response back. So if we go into our TCP Listener, we can see that message, and we can see when we responded back, and we can see the response below. Now if we go into the Mappings tab, we can see a few different mappings. So our local port is going to be what port our channel is set up to. Our local address is going to be what address we're at. So this is just the local address. Our remote port is going to be what port the client sent through. And the remote address is going to be the client. The next source connector listener we'll talk about is the HTTP Listener. This listener allows us to act as an HTTP server so the user can make REST API calls. We've got a few different options we can retrieve messages with. This can be just raw messages or XML. We can also just host static resources or directories to allow it to act as a simple web server. We can also configure how we send responses back to the client. We can configure credentials to authenticate any client attempting to find the server, basic authentication, digest authentication, custom JavaScript, custom Java classes, or using OAuth to connect users to an OAuth server for authentication. Now let's go over a few simple use cases. Let's say we have a client that wants to send us data using an API. We can set up an HTTP listener to listen on a specific port and accept different payloads. We can then return them a custom response, letting them know we got the message, and then route that data to a hospital or database. Now let's look at another example. Let's say a client wants to query us for patient data. We can set up an HTTP listener listening for requests for patients with a patient ID. We can then send a response using a destination where we query our database for patients that match the patient ID and send back a response with the patient's data. Now let's look into how to create an HTTP listener and use it. So first let's create a channel with the source connector as HTTP Listener. We now get some new settings, HTTP authentication, and HTTP Listener settings. But first let's go ahead and give our HTTP Listener a port of 1345. This way we can use this port to send messages. So first we can look at the HTTP authentication. This is going to allow us to authenticate users based on a couple different authentication types. You can see below we have none, and this will allow anybody into our API as long as they have access to the path. We can use basic authentication where we can set different usernames and passwords. We can use digest authentication, which is similar to basic authentication, except the credentials get hashed, and with basic authentication it uses base64 to encode instead of hashing, which makes digest authentication more secure. We also have custom JavaScript, where you can write custom JavaScript to authenticate a user. We also have custom Java classes, which is similar to JavaScript, except we need to import our custom Java class and pass in that class name and the different parameters we want to send to the class. Last we have OAuth 2, which will redirect the user to an OAuth server so they can enter their credentials and pass the access token back to us. For now, we can just set the authentication type to none since we are building this on our local computer. The next settings we'll look at is the HTTP listener settings. To start, we have the base context path. So this is going to be the extra paths we want our client to use when sending us API requests. This can be something like patients. rotations would be after the domain name and port. Note the clients will need to use a trailing slash in the request to this HTTP listener, as we can see in our HTTP URL property. Next we have the receive timeout. This will be the maximum time we want to wait for the client to connect. We have message content, and this is going to be the type of request we're getting. So we can set this to plain or XML. If we select plain, then the message will be interpreted as a raw string. If we select XML, then the message will be serialized as an XML in our channel, so we can break down the message into parts and read data in. If we keep the message content to XML, then we can see a few properties not grayed out. We can use parse multipart to tell our connector to automatically parse out the XML into different nodes. If we want to just leave the message as a single XML document, then we can just select no. Next we can use the include metadata to include any of the metadata from the request into the XML content our connector builds. This can be useful if we want to use any query parameters or methods in our channel. Note that the metadata is still stored in our source map, but this will add it to the XML message. Next we have binary MIME type. We can specify what content types we want to encode to a base64 raw string value. We can use the check mark next to it to use regular expressions to specify the types. If we don't want to have regular expressions checkmarked, then we can split all the types by commas. Next we have the HTTP URL. So this will tell us where the client needs to send requests. This is read only, so we can't modify this field, but we can copy and paste this. And note that if this server has a public IP outside of where you're accessing it, then the client will need to use that IP or domain name instead. Next we have response content type, so this will allow us to specify what MIME type we want to use for the response. Then we have the response data type and the char set encoding, and we can select this if we are sending back binary data or text in our response and encode it using char set encoding. Next we have response status code, so this is used for sending a specific status code back with the response. If this is blank, then the default status is 200 for accepted requests and 500 for messages that erred. Next we have response headers, so this will give the ability to specify any specific headers we want to send in our response to the client. We can use the table to populate this or a map. So if we wanted to add different response headers, then we can add them in the table. So you can name it, and then you can give your value. Lastly, we can use static resources to send back a file, files in a directory, or custom fields in the response. We can specify the path to which files will need to be sent back with using context path column. So if a client was connecting to this API with a custom patient/file path, then we can specify what file to return. So if a client was connecting to this API using a custom patient file path, then we can specify what file to return. Now let's actually run through some examples and how to use this connector. So before we go into our demo, I'll be using an application called Postman to make all of my API calls, and then we can see them in Mirth. So I can just create a new API call, and then we can enter in our request URL, which is going to be our URL to our API. Then we can enter in any additional body, so any form data or anything like that. We can also use authorization, so we can use a drop down to select any authorization that we can use in our Mirth. So for this we'll just use no auth. So this is just not going to pass in any authentication. But you could use basic auth, which would just be a username and password, or digest, or OAuth 2. So let's actually run through a few examples. Let's just start out with interacting with our channel and sending no data at all, just calling the API. So we can copy the link from the HTTP URL, we can go into Postman and create a new API and post our URL into the URL request box. And let's go back and deploy our channel. Now we can go back to Postman and just go ahead and send our message. And you can see that it was successful because we got a 200 HTTP code. So now we can go back to Mirth and look in our dashboard, and look at our channel. We can see that we got a blank message. But now what if we wanted to send an actual message? Let's try to just send a basic raw text to our HTTP listener, and let's say hello. So we can go into our body and do raw, and then just type in hello and send. So let's see now what we got in our channel. So now we can see that we got a message with hello. Now what if we wanted to send back a response back to the sender? In this case, Postman. So right now we have the response as none. We can pick between the options in the source settings. So if we set the response to one of our destinations, we can return a message as a response back to the client. So let's set the response to destination 1 and go to our destinations. And we can set the destination 1 as a JavaScript writer. And let's just return hello there. And we'll deploy that. Now let's go back to Postman and send our same message. And you can see now we have a response hello there. Now let's actually use this to send back something more useful. Let's send back a JSON. We'll go back into our Mirth, go into our channels, we'll go to our destination, and instead of returning hello there, we'll return a JSON. So now you can see I have a JSON of patients with 3 patients in here. Then I'm returning a patients in its string form. So we can save this. The next thing we'll need to do is go to our summary and set our data types. We'll want to set our data type to XML as the source outbound, and then we'll do JSON as our destination 1 outbound. Click OK and deploy. And then let's go back into Postman and get rid of our message and just do none. Then we can send our request, and we can see now we got a JSON of our patients. However, it's not properly formatted. And in order to make it more formatted, we can go back into our Mirth channel and go to our channel, go to source, and then for our response content type, we have it set as text plain. But we can set that to application JSON. Let's deploy it again. And let's send the same message back. Now you can see it's properly formatted. And Postman recognizes as JSON. And that's because in our header, the response type is application JSON. Now that we know how to send back a more useful data type, how about letting the user query that data and send a response back with a specific patient they want, and we can do that through query parameters, or the content they're sending. Let's go ahead and send a patient ID in a query parameter and see what we can see in our Mirth channel. So I added a query parameter called patient ID equals 1. So this means we just want the patient with the ID of 1. So we can go ahead and send this, and we still get our JSON with all our patients back. If we go into our channel, we can see the first message we got. We go to the mappings, and this is located in a few different places. We can see this in our query mapping. We can see this in our URI mapping. We can also see this in our parameters mapping. So we can use these mappings to filter the list in our destination. So if we go back to channels, we go to our destination, we can write some code to filter out depending on what ID we're getting. We can access the mappings we just saw in the message browser view using the source mappings variable and the mapping shortcut. For now, let's just use the source map variable to get our parameters, and then we can use the method getParameters to get the patient ID. So this is going to go to our source map and get the parameters, and then get the parameter patient ID. And then now we can use a for each loop to loop through our patients and return the patient we asked for. Below I just copied and pasted my for each loop, and it's basically saying we want to go through the patients, and for each patient we want to look at its ID and see if it matches our patient ID, and then return a stringified format of that patient JSON. And if it doesn't find it, then it will return an empty string. So let's deploy that. So now we can go back into Postman and try to send this request back. Now we can see we got our first patient with the patient ID of 1, like we wanted. And if we do patient ID 2, we'll get the second patient with the patient ID of 2. And if we do 4, which we only had 3 patients, so it should return an empty string, just like it did. Another way to access our patient ID is we can add the parameters to our incoming message using the include metadata setting. So if we set the message content we're receiving to XML body, we can use include metadata to add that metadata to our body. So now let's save our changes, deploy, and we'll send a message back. And we'll go into our Mirth channel and look at our messages, and you can see now that we have the metadata in our message. So we can access this in our destination very similarly to what we did with our source map. Let's go back to our channel. We'll go down destination. We can access this using the connector message variable. So you can see now I have our connector message variable, and we're getting our encoded data. And then we're looking through that XML to get parameters and then our patient ID. So we can use these square brackets in order to access this data in an XML. So now let's save and deploy. We can go ahead and send a message back through with Postman and see what we get back. So we still got it empty. So now if we do 1, then we should get patient 1 back. So now you can see John Doe. The next source connector listener we'll talk about is the Web Service Listener. This listener is very similar to the HTTP Listener, but instead of posting an HTTP endpoint, it'll post a SOAP endpoint. We can use the SOAP protocols instead of the REST protocols, and this makes the client adhere to more strict SOAP standards to send data. Out of the box, Mirth gives us one service with one operation to receive messages and send back a response. There's not as much customizability as the HTTP listener, but we can create a custom service with custom operations. When a user sends in a SOAP request, then Mirth handles the SOAP request and only passes in the message being sent. For example, if we have a long SOAP envelope being sent, then Mirth will only process the argument. With the Web Service Listener, we don't get as many mappings as we get with the HTTP Listener. For this lesson, we'll only be going over the service class that Mirth gives us, but I'll talk about creating a custom service class in the advanced course. Now let's take a look at the source connector. So let's go ahead and create our new channel and attach the web service to our connector. We can now see a new setting called Web Service Listener Settings. We can configure these settings to adjust the web service. So we can keep the service as the default, which is com.mirth.connect.connectors.ws.default_accept_message. Or we can change it to a custom service we built. If we select service, then we can use the service class name to provide a custom service class for our connector to use in service class name. We'll just leave the web service as default for this lesson. Next we can see what we want to name the service, and if we change this, then our URL path will get updated, like we can see in the WSDL URL. We can select a specific binding we want. If we use default, then the connector will use the annotation in the web service class, but if no annotation is found, then it will automatically use SOAP 1.1. We can also specifically specify if we want to use SOAP 1.1 or 1.2. Next we have the WSDL URL, which will tell us where our web service description language is at. This is used for describing the functionality of the SOAP web service and what different methods and envelope structure to create. This is read-only, so we can copy and paste this. Next is the method the service will use. This will be accept message as default, but if we have a custom service, then it will only display custom web service methods. Now let's go ahead and deploy this, and let's look at a basic example and send in a message to our channel. I'll also be using Postman to send in our message, and we can import the message using our WSDL link provided in our channel. So we can go to Import and select a link, and we can post our link. Continue, and this should make our request so we can send in a message. Import, and then we go to the drop down, we can see an Accept Message Post API call. We can click on that, we can go to the body, we can see the envelope. Now we can send an argument to our accept message method. I copy and pasted the envelope that we need to use with our argument as our message. Now let's go ahead and send this. Now if we go back to Mirth, we can see just the argument we sent in. Now we can see the message that I just sent in. We can also send back a response using the destination. So let's go into our channel, go to our source tab, and set the response as destination 1. Now we can go to our destinations and go to destination 1 and change our connector type to JavaScript Reader. And we can return a message that says thank you for your message. Now we can save and deploy this. And we'll go back into Postman and we'll send our message again and see what response we get back. You can see now that we got a return response with thank you for your message in our return.